Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out on this hot day to think about superheroes. My name's Jill Lepore. I'm an American political historian. I teach in the history department here, and I also teach here in the law school. I teach a class called the History of Evidence. Weirdly, somehow on the brochure for this event, I have accumulated a law degree that I don't have. Thank you. Thank you. I never went to law school. So this is just to be full disclosure, don't credit me as someone who's an alum of this venerable institution, but I'm delighted to be here to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the law school, which has very deep ties to the character of Wonder Woman. The guy who created Wonder Woman is a law school alum, unlike me. And it's a really interesting figure, and the work that he did in the law school and the work that he did as a professor of legal psychology is really foundational to the character of Wonder Woman. So I'm going to try to talk about that a little bit today. I mainly just have some goofy images to show you, which are kind of a stock set of images that aren't so much targeted for the really important legal history story behind Wonder Woman, but I'll try to spend a few extra moments on that story. We're supposed to be out of here at 5:30. We got a slightly late start. I want to have plenty of time for people to ask questions and compare Wonder Woman origin stories of their own. People always have I want to tell the lunchbox story. The Underoos story is a famous one. So happy to leave plenty of time for questions. I kind of just want to begin by saying that many people think of Wonder Woman as a 1970s character because of Linda Carter's television portrayal that was just really pretty memorable and remains iconic. But you can get up and dance. I just would say I never watched Wonder Woman as a kid because I watched The Man from Atlantis. Did anybody watch The Man from Atlantis with Patrick Duffy? Yeah. So my brother watched Wonder Woman. And I often say, like, if I ever wrote a memoir, I'd be called Little Straight Girl. Because, like, I just wanted to watch Patrick Duffy swim with his Speedo pretty much all the time when I was a kid. So the whole Wonder Woman fad passed me by as a kid. And I came to this project writing an account of Wonder Woman chiefly as a political historian and a historian of evidence. And one of the first things that's important in thinking about with the history of the character herself, of course, dates from the 1940s and was a publicity stunt that was launched by the forerunners of DC Comics to address concerns. People were burning comic books in town squares. Comic books were banned. Superman and Batman were banned. Superman for being vaguely fascist. He's an Ubermensch. And Batman because Batman, when he started, carried a gun. So the creators of DC Comics hired a very famous consulting psychologist named Moulton Marston to help them deal with their publicity problem. And he suggested that they inaugurate a female superhero. And he created Wonder Woman. And they used a poll to decide to ask readers, should Wonder Woman, even though a woman, be allowed to join the Justice Society? So remember, Superman started in 1938, Batman in 1939, Wonder Woman started in 41, and in 1942, this poll was conducted. Interestingly enough, you can probably get a little bit of a sense here that the poll was rigged. Like there was that question, should Wonder Woman be allowed to join the Justice Society even though a woman? And then there was, which of these people should be the newest member of the Justice Society? And it's like, Wonder Woman has a really big head and also is giving away the free goodies. And then these like two-bit losers who are her competition. One of the things that was really fun for me as a historian working on this project is that most history written about comic books is written by comic book fans, and it's really fun, but it's fan literature. It's not written generally by people who know their way around archives or trawl through archives. So some of the really fun findings I had include, this is just a thing that I love, it's the returns of the poll. And you can see these numbers here, the number of boys and girls who said yes, Wonder Woman should be allowed even though a woman, to join the Justice Society, and those who said no. This is at the same time that the Gallup organization started in 1937, polling every year. Should a woman, even though a woman, be allowed to run for president? This was a kind of send-up of that. It's a really interesting moment in the history of feminism. But as those of you who are fans know, Wonder Woman does get elected to the Justice Society. Only Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman from this era of comics have remained continuously in print since then. But Wonder Woman is the only woman in the Justice Society, and she becomes the secretary. So it's not really the most exciting 1940s moment. But Wonder Woman, in addition to being elected into the Justice Society in 1942, right after her debut, gets her own comic book. And she is an incredibly big seller for her comic book publisher in 1942. But for a comic book that was introduced to quiet the controversy over comic books, she went on to become one of the most controversial comic book characters ever created. And so I want to talk, I'm going to give you like a sort of very brief, narrow history, and then I'm going to go give you the deeper, I think, more interesting political history of the character that takes us right here to the Harvard Law School. Wonder Woman was published under a pseudonym. It was published under the name Charles Moulton. But when Wonder Woman got her own magazine, there was a huge PR blitz, including this page from one of the Wonder Woman issues, The Men Behind Wonder Woman. And the men behind Wonder Woman are Marston, here's our Harvard Law School alum, sitting there in the front to the left. MC Gaines, who's the publisher of what becomes DC Comics. Shelley Mayer is the editor, and the only guy with the jacket in the back, and then Harry G. Peter, who's the artist in shirt sleeves. There was also a big campaign to write to eminent women in the United States and ask them to participate in spreading the word about Wonder Woman, which really was meant to be feminist propaganda. As you can see here in the press release that Marston wrote, Wonder Woman was conceived by Dr. Marston to set up a standard among children and young people of strong, free, courageous womanhood, and to combat the idea that women are inferior to men, and to inspire girls to self-confidence and achievement in athletics, occupations, and professions monopolized by men, because the only hope for civilization is the greater freedom, development, and equality of women in all fields of human activity. This is where people usually clap. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing. It's 1942. It's a very overt feminist message. This is not one of these coy, like, I'm a feminist, but only, or I believe in equal rights, but I'm not a feminist. It's a very just straight out, the only hope for civilization is for women to gain equality in all realms of civilization. Really interesting, powerful message at the realm of pop culture. And the comic book itself, from the 1940s when Marston was writing it, carries that same sensibility. Wonder Woman runs for president. People always point, yes, it's 1,000 years in the future, it's true. But nevertheless, it's not just the press releases or the stories, but in his private correspondence, Marston said things like this when asked in a letter, why did you create Wonder Woman? And he said, Wonder Woman is psychological propaganda for the new type of woman who I believe should rule the world, like Encore, like that. It's really interesting that this thing just comes out into the world during the Second World War. It seems both ahead of its time and also behind its time. As a historian, I find that really interesting. And the way that I think about Wonder Woman is other superheroes have secret identities, but Wonder Woman has a secret history, because Marston was a very secretive man, and he was also a pathological liar. So he has these fantastic little clues. This is one of my favorite. There was also a newspaper strip for a while. Here, Wonder Woman is running away from some reporters who are trying to track down her story. And this is the editor of the newspaper who's trying to get the story from Wonder Woman. And he's so upset that he hasn't got the story out of Wonder Woman that he goes to the hospital, and Diana Prince takes pity on him. So she disguises herself as a nurse. You can always, she puts on her glasses and no one knows who she is. So here she is, and she brings him, she brings him the secret history of Wonder Woman. And he's so excited that he runs back to the office in his hospital Johnny. Stop the presses, I've got the history of Wonder Woman. It turns out to be just a piece of papyrus with a bunch of Greek letters on it. But Marston was really playful with his readers about that there was something that he wasn't letting anybody know about Wonder Woman, that she was a lot more than she appeared to be. So as a historian coming to this project, knowing a lot about political history, knowing a lot about Harvard, knowing a lot, especially about the history of feminism, but knowing really almost nothing about the history of comics, I was really intrigued by the degree to which the stories in Wonder Woman in the 1940s were autobiographical. They're all about Marston. Here he is, young little Marston, as a baby. He grew up in Malden. And here he is as a Harvard freshman in 1911, very handsome young man. When Marston was a freshman here at Harvard, the Men's League for Women's Suffrage invited the British suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst to come speak in Harvard Yard, in Sanders Theater. And the Harvard Corporation said, no, women are not allowed to speak in Harvard Yard. So Emmeline Pankhurst came and spoke at, do you know where the Algiers Cafe is? People know Harvard Square? A little bit. It was a dance hall then. But the reason Emmeline Pankhurst in particular couldn't speak at Harvard, women were not allowed to speak at Harvard, but she was a militant suffragist who militarized the suffrage movement in the United States. She and her followers practiced nonviolent resistance. They chained themselves to the gates outside 10 Downing Street. American suffragists in imitation chained themselves to the gates outside the White House, and she was arrested, and she and her followers went on hunger strikes and were forcibly fed. She was a real rabble-rouser and really transformed the suffrage movement, which had been going on for decades and going nowhere. Well, Marston went to see her the fall of his freshman year, and it really affected him. And it also affected him that she had been banned from Harvard. So when you read the comics from the 1940s, Wonder Woman is very often trying to leap over the gates to get into Harvard Yard. She's doing things that suffragists did in the 19-teens when Marston was a young man, watching these things actually happen. Or she's doing things, she will just put on a varsity sweatshirt with an H on it and sneak into lecture halls, like this one. Very transgressive activity at a time when Radcliffe students were not allowed to take classes with Harvard men. What happened when Radcliffe was founded in the 1880s is the Harvard faculty would walk to Radcliffe Yard and teach the Radcliffe girls there. But they couldn't possibly be contaminated by studying with the Harvard men. Marston was in love with his childhood sweetheart, an incredible woman named Elizabeth Holloway, who went to Mount Holyoke, one of the first women's colleges, a hotbed of suffragism. She was a classic new woman. She was a suffragist. She was a field hockey player. She was a thriving, an aspiring journalist. And she went to college on a campus that was leading the suffragist cause, a kind of militant form of suffragism in the 19-teens. Marston spent a lot of time out there at Mount Holyoke visiting with her. While he was here at Harvard, he decided to study psychology, which is a new field, the transformation and the origins of social sciences. And he was really interested in the problems with trial by jury. Marston became fascinated with questions of evidence. At the time, people were beginning to understand, using the tools of experimental psychology, that eyewitness testimony was quite unreliable. Not only that, but juries were really quite terrible at evaluating witness testimony or any testimony at all on a stand. And Marston had the idea that he could abolish trial by jury and replace trial by jury with trial by lie detector. And he he's often credited himself as the inventor of the lie detector, and he was quite close to being the inventor. A lot of other people worked on lie detection. Marston was maybe the best self-promoter of them. But he studied with this guy named Hugo Münsterberg, who was a German experimental psychologist who founded the first experimental psychology laboratory, and it was here at Harvard. Here's Münsterberg's lab. And Münsterberg happened to be deeply opposed to women's suffrage, deeply opposed to women's equality. But he loved teaching at Radcliffe because he really liked to chain up women and do tests on them. So thinking about that as Marston's intellectual grounding, the villain in Wonder Woman, the early comics, is a German experimental psychologist named Dr. Psycho, who likes to put Wonder Woman in cages and do experiments on her, essentially. So for me, it was just sort of remarkable. People hadn't noticed how deeply autobiographical the comics were. A thing that's fascinating, among the many fascinating things about young William Moulton Marston, his advisor, Münsterberg, was very interested in moving pictures and using moving pictures to do psychological experiments. The silent films was a new technology, and Münsterberg he enjoyed putting women in a room and attaching them to machines and then showing them provocative things and seeing what their physiological reactions were. And Marston liked that too. Marston also wrote his way, he wrote screenplays in college to pay his way through Harvard, including this film, Jack Kennard. And this film, there's no sound, this is a silent film, which is a classic story. It was directed by D.W. Griffith, the year D.W. Griffith was working on Birth of a Nation. But it's about a man and his fiancée. He's living in a hotel. His fiancée comes to visit, and during her visit, it's revealed that he's hidden a maid in the closet. Marston had a three-way marriage. This was very much autobiographical as well. But just to point out that Marston, as an undergraduate, was a storyteller. He was really interested in film as a medium. And motion pictures and comic books have a lot in common in terms of what they offer up. So Marston married Elizabeth Holloway when they both graduated in 1915. And it was not until 1941, though, that he created Wonder Woman, when he was a much, much older man, when he had 4 children and 2 wives at the same time, and when he was really interested in pornography, and when he wrote erotica, essentially, for gentlemen's magazines. A lot of Wonder Woman's aesthetics, and the reason that people think of Wonder Woman as a 1940s product if they don't think of her a 1970s product is because her aesthetic is that of the erotic pinup girl, of the Betty Grable on the bomber jet, the airbrushed Betty Grable. Marston wrote captions and stories about these women, these pinup girls, for a men's magazine called True Magazine. George Petty, who did those Esquire magazine, a lot of Esquire magazine pinup girls, would draw these women, and Marston would, as a famed psychologist, explain how to seduce them. Hugh Hefner had this, it's a centerfold for a magazine. He had this centerfold on the wall of his adolescent bedroom in the 1940s. This is where Playboy comes from, but basically comes from William Moulton and Marston as well. I'm really deeply interested in pornography. Here's Marston's explanation for how you should seduce Miss Chummy Bunny. But who actually really has got a lot in common visually with superheroes. Female superheroes obviously just all look like porn stars, right? Like that's the aesthetic that they derive from. Wonder Woman, which was, again, created to quiet a controversy, became really controversial because of the bondage in Wonder Woman. She's tied up, she's chained up. And Marston always said, because this became very controversial very quickly, that this was because she was an allegory for the emancipation of women, and women were subject to the slavery of men, had been made slaves by men, and they needed to emancipate themselves, allegorically in every episode. And he refused to give up the chains. And people have been very cynical. Readers of the comics who looked at it, very degrading depiction, or very kinky if you admire the kink in it. But I think what most people had not seen before was when I look at this image, which leaps out to me automatically, this is a suffrage image. It's not a pornographic image, although there's plenty of pornography in it and in Wonder Woman. This image comes from the suffrage cartoons and the feminist cartoons and also the birth control cartoons of a cartoonist named Annie Lucasta Rogers, who published as Lou Rogers, who represented woman as an Amazon. This is a really important suffrage idea, that women were Amazons, and tied women up and chained women up in order to represent them breaking free of their chains. It's an iconography that's suffragists borrowed from the abolitionist movement. And women in the 19-teens marched in chains. They chained themselves to the White House. Being seen, depicted in chains, allegorically, was the stock and trade of the suffrage movement in the 19-teens. You can, I think, see the connection even more vividly here. On the right is a drawing by Harry G. Peter, the Wonder Woman artist. And I would just point out, Harry G. Peter and Lou Rogers in the 19-teens worked on the same magazine, drawing suffrage cartoons for the same magazine. Marston hired Harry G. Peter to draw Wonder Woman, presumably because he was an ex-suffrage cartoonist. So it's not something that I've just imagined. It's not just the visual evidence that suggests this is a suffrage image. It's the biographical connection here that suggests this is a suffrage image. There's a lot, when you look at Wonder Woman, if you're familiar with the history of feminism, that suggests that Wonder Woman really is, she's not from the 1970s, she's really not from the 1940s, she's from the 19-teens. Wonder Woman rides a white horse. She wears a tiara. Women in suffrage parades were always led by a woman wearing a tiara riding a white horse. This is some Amazonian thing, but it was just the convention. And although I think we carry around in our heads a kind of light box of a whole gallery of images of, say, the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s, most of us don't carry around in our heads a gallery of these images of the suffrage movement of the 19-teens, but these were really iconic photographs that people didn't know in the 19-teens. So when Harry G. Peter redraws these images, they're speaking to people of their generation, not the little boys and girls who are reading it, but it was obvious then when Wonder Woman fights for women's equal pay, that the iconography and the nature of the march is coming from strike action of progressive era labor reformers who included Margaret Sanger. Marston finished his degree at Harvard. Then he came to the law school, where he was a quite complicated and largely indifferent student. Did psychological experiments, really, during the First World War, trying to use the lie detector to interrogate prisoners of war, and then did a PhD in the psychology department at Harvard. And then he taught at American University, where, as a beginning professor, he was given a chair in legal psychology, and where he convinced his law school students at American University School of Law, who were defending pro bono a guy named James Fry, who was accused of murder, that they should use Fry's case as a way to test the admissibility in a court of law of the lie detector. So many of you will know the Fry ruling from 1922 that established the standard of evidence by which expert scientific evidence can be entered into a court of law. It came from Marston. This is Marston here, and this is James Fry. Marston trying to get, Fry confessed and then said, no, my confession was a lie, and Marston tried to have his lie detector test with Fry entered as evidence. The court struck it down, not necessarily because the lie detector wasn't reliable, but because in between the trial and the appeal, Marston was arrested for fraud. This is something that people don't know about Fry. It's the standard of evidence still in most states. But it's a really interesting case. I wrote a long piece in the late Yale Law Journal about the history of the Fry case and how the facts of the case really call into question how a rule could ever have been devised from it. But this didn't destroy Marston's legal career. He was fired from American University for being arrested on several federal charges of fraud. But he got his revenge in Wonder Woman, where Wonder Woman introduces as evidence in a court of law her magic lasso. You recall that's what the magic lasso is a lie detector. Anyone she lassos with it is forced to tell the truth. So just trying to continue my argument that Wonder Woman really is autobiographical and really has to do with events from the 19-teens and some from the 1920s. After he taught at American University and was fired, Marston moved to Tufts, where he was a professor of psychology. And here he is, having gained a bit of weight in 1926. This guy here. Here's his wife, EHM, Elizabeth Holloway Marston. Here's his star student, Olive Byrne, graduating. And here's Olive Byrne's mother, Ethel Byrne. This is the most important piece of the Marston story because Marston, while advising Olive Byrne, they began an affair. And Marston said to his wife, I'm in love with a younger woman. I would like the three of us to live together. And if you don't agree, I will leave you. She ended up agreeing, and they lived together for the rest of their lives. And they raised 4 children together. There's a lot that's really important and significant here, but most important and significant and underappreciated is Olive Byrne, who's seen here. This is her sorority picture. Here she is with her. She's the one with the bandana. Her sorority is really important to the story of Wonder Woman. Her sorority is a part of all the storylines. Olive Byrne was an extraordinary young woman. She was quite an iconoclast. She dressed as a boy, a very unusual thing to do in the 1920s. She was voted the wittiest and cleverest and most distinctive member of her class at Tufts. And among the many things that she was famous for was providing birth control to all of the female students at Tufts because her aunt was Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood. She also tried to get Margaret Sanger to speak at Tufts, and as with Emmeline Pankhurst, Sanger was banned from campus. She spoke at a church in Somerville instead. So this is a really interesting relationship, but the sort of unsung hero here is Ethel Byrne, Margaret Sanger's sister, who, with Margaret Sanger, founded the feminist movement in 1914 with the Woman Rebel, the first feminist newspaper in this country. Marston, Margaret Sanger and Ethel Byrne, 2 sisters. They were nurses. They coined the term birth control. in this first feminist paper, and they opened the first birth control clinic together in Brooklyn in 1916, and they were arrested and brought to trial in 1917. Here is Margaret Sanger on your left and Ethel Byrne on the right. She looks exactly like Olive Byrne when you see the photos of Olive Byrne. Ethel Byrne was tried first. She was convicted and sentenced to 30 days in prison. She had trained with Emmeline Pankhurst. She was a feminist and a suffragist and a birth control activist. These two women founded birth control. They founded what becomes Planned Parenthood in particular. Ethel Byrne went on a hunger strike and nearly died. And Margaret Sanger made a deal when her sister was on death's door that if the governor of New York would pardon her sister so she would live, Sanger would vouch for her sister that her sister would never again be involved in the birth control movement, which is the only reason you've heard of Margaret Sanger, but you haven't heard of Ethel Byrne. She was far more radical than her sister, in fact. Margaret Sanger, when she founded the Birth Control Review, hired the famous suffragist cartoonist Lou Rogers to draw birth control cartoons. Here is one of them, using that same iconography of chains and balls and chains that appears repeatedly and seems so kinky and purely pornographic in Wonder Woman, but that comes out of the iconography, again, of suffrage, feminism, and birth control. Similarly, the many times that Wonder Woman is gagged. Here's Sanger famously gagged. It's a very, very famous, iconic photograph of Sanger. She came to Boston. She was unable to speak. The historian Arthur Schlesinger went on stage and read her remarks in her stead in protest. Wonder Woman and her mother here, often bound in the same way, in ways that gesture toward those other photographs. So Marston marries into the Margaret Sanger family. He forms a family of sex radicals with Sanger's niece. They vacation on Cape Cod and Truro, either staying at Margaret Sanger's house or at Ethel Byrne's house. They both summer in Truro together, where all the radicals and sex radicals do. Here's Marston. Here's his wife, Elizabeth Holloway Marston. There's Olive Byrne. And these are their 4 children. Each woman has 2 children by Marston. They have this really, really interesting family life. What they have given up is Marston's academic career, because he's been blacklisted from academia because of his family arrangements. He writes this really interesting book, The Emotions of Normal People, which was published in 1928 with a lot of help from Olive Byrne, who was his chief research assistant and was herself pursuing a PhD at Columbia. Marston was teaching at Columbia at the time. It's really it's a fascinating book. It's a manifesto against sexual intolerance. You can read the quote here and get some sense of it. But Marston is blacklisted in 1928. He writes to all of his Harvard advisors for letters of recommendation, and they blacklist him because they know about the family arrangements. So he does what many a blacklisted, defrocked academic does. He goes to Hollywood, where he has this kooky career as an advisor to major motion pictures, and he does experiments like this one. I think I should be able to show you a little clip of this. Maybe I can't get the cursor to work. Oh, well. Well, this is a funny newsreel about Marston. You could hear his voice. He has a hilarious voice. So that was just sort of my brief biographical sketch to suggest that Wonder Woman really is inspired by the events that Marston witnessed and that his very own family was engaged in the 19-teens, suffrage, feminism, and birth control. Marston contracted polio and died in 1947. Wonder Woman had a really checkered history subsequently. Wonder Woman, what is her secret history? It's Marston's. It's Elizabeth Holloway Marston, very much an inspiration for the character. Olive Byrne, who looks the most like the character. But above all, really, Wonder Woman is Margaret Sanger. The kind of heroism, the particular fights that she fights. What's so fascinating then when you think about that is what it has meant that no one has known that all these years. But what really happened was for Marston and his family, he had given up a lot for his family arrangements. And Wonder Woman was controversial enough. And Margaret Sanger was not a controversial figure in the same way then as she later became. She was controversial, but she was not really more controversial than, say, Eleanor Roosevelt. She was the best-known feminist in the world in the 1930s and 40s. And the family really made a decision to keep the family arrangements a secret. And the family ties to Margaret Sanger are completely unknown by the public. The kids weren't even told like what their family arrangement was. Everything really was a secret for many, 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 many years. Not until the 1960s when two of the children confronted Olive Byrne about who their father was where things even really revealed to the kids. And I think there's some dispute even now in some ways about the different stories that different parts of the family tell. But how I think about the importance of that is historians often think about the women's movement, the fight for women's rights in the United States anyway, as beginning in 1848 with the Seneca Falls, where the first women's rights convention. That's a first wave that ends in 1920 when women get the right to vote. And then there's kind of nothing that happens until 1963 and the feminine mystique, Betty Friedan, and then you have Ms. Magazine is 1972. You have the women's liberation movement. But Wonder Woman, which starts in 1941 and is inspired by the feminism of the 19-teens, and then goes on to inspire women in the women's liberation movement, like Gloria Steinem grew up reading Wonder Woman, really is the missing link in the history of the struggle for women's equality in the United States. And the fact that there are family ties that make that visible, that were kept hidden because of a family scandal, sort of unfortunately erased a big piece of women's history, women's political history, from our common shared understanding, so that we can look at Wonder Woman and be like, oh, she's just a girl Superman. Nothing could be less true. She's the founder of Planned Parenthood. Like, that's actually really interesting. That's much more interesting. So I just briefly talk about, so after Marston died, World War II was over by then. Women were being asked to return to the home, have more children. Wonder Woman becomes a really different character in the hands of other writers.
It's raining cats and dogs.
I don't have time to show you that clip. We can do it in Q&A. She's reinvented many times by DC Comics, always by male writers and male artists who have no idea what to do with her. They try to update her for the feminist, for the women's liberation movement. She's updated very much by women involved in the women's liberation movement. Here, this is an early Wonder Woman cartoon by Edward Sorel in New York Magazine at a time when Steinem was a staff writer. Feminist comics, the underground feminist comic movement starts. This is my favorite 70s moment of Wonder Woman's iconic resurrection by feminists, because DC Comics does not successfully reinvent Wonder Woman, but feminist comics and politicians do. These feminist comics from California put out this comic book called It Ain't Me, Babe, with all these 1930s heroes like Olive Oil and Lulu and Wonder Woman and like Sheena the Jungle Queen, you can see her there. And inside they all break out of their stock plots. Like Veronica and Betty run away together. Like they ditch Archie and they fall in love and they have great sex. And Lulu has this encounter with, I don't know what the boy's names. He's forming a club. He says, no girls allowed. And she pauses to think about that. And then the next panel really is kind of the epitome of the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. Which I made this into a T-shirt. Apologies for the copyright infringement. It's just for me. But when Ms. Magazine is launched in 1972, we forget this, but Wonder Woman was on the first cover of Ms. Magazine. And inside the comic were pages of the original Marston comics from the 1940s, because Gloria Steinem had been such a fan. She really does become the icon of the women's liberation movement. This is another favorite of mine. It's a newsletter where Wonder Woman's wielding a speculum, and inside are instructions on how to conduct your own vaginal self-exam. Here's Wonder Woman. This is the National Women's Political Caucus. Wonder Woman taking over Nixon's cabinet, which would have been a good moment. And then Wonder Woman has had a more checkered fate since then. We'll skip through here. You know that she's now this movie character. You've all seen this movie. Just wanted to just kind of end here with reflecting on the journey that the character has made. I guess this should be 2017 is when the movie finally came out. But the Wonder Woman of 1912 was a very different character, fighting for political equality and economic equality for all women, which indeed is what Marston's character was doing. It's a very complicated representation of female power, but it's actually, if anything, quite familiar today because we have this sort of sex-positive feminism, which I confess I don't quite entirely get, but that's a lot of what's going on here. The one big difference historically with this representation is that the feminists and suffragists and birth control activists were generally pacifists. So a lot of what women do in Lou Rogers' cartoons, for instance, is break swords. They would never carry a sword. You wouldn't see an Amazon from the 19-teens wielding a sword in a threatening fashion. That's inimical to what suffragists were doing. They were arguing to get the vote to put an end to the First World War, among other things, by the time that war had begun, which is, someone was asking earlier about my response to the film, which is set during, it really kind of, it presents itself as a critique of war, but it's just another war film. It's really quite dismissive of the political inheritance that the character carries in her own representation. So I just wanted to kind of call your attention to the contrast here. So thanks very much. So I've left time for questions and comments. And I'm also happy to go back if I skipped over something or tell you more about Fry versus US, 1923, and the law of evidence. I didn't know if you guys were like law geeks or Wonder Woman geeks, or I didn't really know. Yeah?
Did Marston's Wonder Woman have a sword?
No. No.
When did she first have the sword?
So she has bracelets that stop bullets, which are, they have two really interesting origins. One is when Marston and his wife had a ceremony marking their wedding together with Olive Byrne, Marston gave her these very dramatic bracelets, which the family still has. And Wonder Woman wears them. The same way Wonder Woman wears Olive Byrne's other jewelry. These are kind of gestures of love between Marston and Olive Byrne. I have just a side note that I actually think is really interesting. When Ms. Magazine wanted to put Wonder Woman on the cover, they needed to get permission from Elizabeth Holloway Marston. So Marston dies in 1947, but Olive Byrne and Elizabeth Holloway Marston live together the rest of their lives. They're inseparable. You know, they're grandmothers together. And so they're both alive. Steinem has Holloway Marston come to New York to look at the page proofs and stuff and this whole exchange. And then Wonder Woman becomes kind of a thing. And a woman at Berkeley in the English department decides to do a PhD thesis about the origins of Wonder Woman. She writes to Elizabeth Holloway Marston, like she gets her address from Gloria Steinem. And she's like, where do the bracelets come from? And this is a point out, this is 1975. Elizabeth Holloway has been living with Olive Byrne since 1925. For 50 years, they have been inseparable domestic partners. She writes back to the Berkeley PhD. She says, oh, those belong to some former student of Dr. Marston's. Like, Olive Byrne is completely written out of, you know, even in the 70s, she's completely erased from the story. So one of the things that's interesting about the bracelets and the way that she's present in the character is Marston giving her visibility that she didn't have in their family life or in their community, where people thought she was the housekeeper, generally, or the governess of the children. The bracelets were important because the critique of Batman and Superman was that they were excessively violent. And the United States was going to war. There was just so much danger and peril in the world. Did children really need to be seeing people shot and hurt and seeing the heroes doing the shooting? That Batman had a gun was really cut. That's why they went back and invented a origin story for Batman, which he hates guns somehow, like even though he used guns the first few episodes. So the fact that Wonder Woman would never use a weapon and that she could stop the most dangerous weapons was really crucial to her character and its claim for political palatability, honestly. So she gets, I think I had this image up for a minute. The thing I think is kind of most disgusting, honestly, is this, the highly sexualized gun-toting. This is the year before the Trayvon Martin shooting. Maybe it's the year after. Was it 2011? You know, there's just the glorification and the pornography of gun violence that iterations of the character represent could not be. I mean, whatever. Call me. They're not sacred. They're these goofy, you know, children's characters. Like people reinvent them all the time, and they're going to change them all the time. But this happens to be, I find, kind of concerning. Yeah. Let's some more. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
So what did Olive Byrne do? Was she a writer too? And could she have written any of
Olive Byrne wanted to be a writer. Her brother Jack Byrne, was a famous publisher of comic books. He was the publisher of Fiction House, which is a big comic book publisher. And I think that a lot of how Marston ended up being in the world of comics comes through Olive Byrne and through her brother. She was a staff writer for Family Circle magazine in the 1930s. And she wrote a lot of different kinds of pieces, but her stock in trade was she would do these pieces where she did a profile of her brother, for instance. She published under a pen name, so she could interview her brother without it being her brother. And she would do these pieces where she would go take the train out to Rye, New York, to visit the house of world-famous consulting psychologist Dr. William Moulton Marston and ask his advice, which you can imagine was very playful and sexually fun for them, the pretending of that they were complete strangers and that she could write stories about him for the magazine that would advance his career and her career. So the very first one is, because obviously she lives in that house and her children are there, but she pretends to be a widow with 2 boys. So in the very first one of these Family Circle stories, which also is funny because really it's Family Triangle, not Family Circle. I just think women buying these things at the grocery store with this family that's passing itself off as, it's just hilarious. I think they thought that was very funny. It's obviously fraud, but it's also very funny. But so the first one, she goes to see him to ask her advice because one of her sons is become a kind of compulsive liar, and she wants his advice, which is just very funny because he's the inventor of the lie detector. But in one of them, I think it's in 1940, she goes to see him to say, I don't know what to do because my boys really like reading comic books like Superman, but I read everywhere that they're so dangerous for kids because they're so violent. What should I do? And they have this whole exchange, and they together agree that they're just like folk tales and fairy tales, and they're harmless, and they help children play out their aggression, and they have this whole theory about it. MC Gaines reads that story and then writes to Marston to have him come to the office. She types the scripts early on. The very first one, which is called Suprema, the family still has the typescript. I think it's actually now at the Smithsonian. So what she contributed by way of prose, or the kids also were asked to come up with story ideas. Some of them have tales about stories they were paid for by DC Comics. But when Marston became sick in 1944, he had just a few months earlier hired a 19-year-old girl named Joy Hummel, a very beautiful young woman, to be his assistant. Unsurprising that he would do so. But he had decided he needed a young person to help out because he didn't know kid slang. And so she had been helping him work on scripts. And when he became ill, she wrote Wonder Woman. She wrote a lot of Wonder Woman between 1944 and 1947. And like most women in comics, but completely erased from that history. She's also a very private person. I tracked her down when I was working on the book, and I went to see her in Florida. No one had ever found her or interviewed her. And she has all of her typewritten scripts, and she had her receipts from all of her pay, and her, a calendar book where she kept track of her meetings and what script she was working on. So in my book, I have this whole long appendix about who wrote what to try to credit her, more properly, because people don't know that Wonder Woman was written by a woman for 3 years in the 1940s. So there are a lot of other sources of influence. This woman, Dorothy Rubicek, was an editor at DC Comics for a time, and she really helped shape the character. There was a woman named Loretta Bender, who's MD, PhD, who was the head of the children's ward at Bellevue, who was a consultant for DC Comics and contributed a lot toward the character's development. So actually, a lot of women had their hands on the character in different ways, and I think including the women in the family, although Marston really was a writer. He wrote all the time, and I think is probably properly credited with most of what he is credited with there. Yeah.
It's such an amazing story. It's truth is stranger than fiction.
Yeah.
How did you find this story, and how did you know that it would be such a
So, again, I'm not a historian of comics or even a fan of Wonder, so I stumbled into it. So 2 things happened. I had agreed to give a talk at the Yale Legal Theory Workshop, and I had to write a paper for it. And I really was interested. This was a number of years ago, but the problem that is on everybody's lips now is how do we know what's true in an age of fake news? But that's been going on for quite a while. So I was really interested in the idea that that there were efforts in the past to devise machines that could tell, the way we kind of hope that Google or Facebook could somehow tell us what's true and what's not true. The lie detector is like that. So I was really interested in the history of the lie detector. So I started doing some research on this guy, Marston, who had created the lie detector. And there were a lot of scholarly papers and stuff. But his Wikipedia entry was really the only, his family archives weren't anywhere. You know, if you look as a historian to see where people's papers were not anywhere. And his Wikipedia entry was like, the craziest thing was like, William Moulton Marston invented the lie detector in 1913 when he was a junior at Harvard, and later lived with Olive Byrne and his wife, Elizabeth Holloway Marston, and in 1941 created Wonder Woman, and then he died. And it was like, who is this guy? Like, that's just nuts. So I had, put that in my head that I didn't know this much about him. But I was working on this scholarly paper about the Fry trial. I got the grand jury cases unsealed from Fry and doing all this legal history research for this paper. Meanwhile, I worked for the New Yorker, and I was given an assignment to write a history of Planned Parenthood because this was 2011, the very beginning of the 2012 election cycle. I don't know if you recall, but all the Republican candidates were more or less required to sign the Susan B. Anthony pledge. If elected, I promise to defund Planned Parenthood. And so my editor had said, like, when did that begin? Like, when did Planned Parenthood become so controversial? Like, don't they just do whatever? So I had gone to Smith College, which has the Planned Parenthood archives and Margaret Sanger's papers, was doing a lot of archival work there. And meanwhile, doing all this other research on Marston and the lie detector and the Fry case, doing archival work in court records. And every time I would be at Smith, I would come across more letters from Ethel Byrne to Margaret Sanger and Olive Byrne and Margaret Sanger and Marston. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, then I knew that that was the same Olive Byrne, but that's just weird. And then the Smith College Library had recently acquired, but had not yet cataloged, the papers of Ms. Magazine and of Gloria Steinem. And so I went to see the archivist in her office one day, and she said, "Weren't you just here looking at the Planned Parenthood papers?" And I said, "Yeah, but now I'm looking at the Ms. Magazine papers and the Steinem papers, but they're not cataloged. And if I give you a list of names, might you be able to tell me what boxes to kind of paw through?" Because archivists just tend to have, like, they know where everything is before they write the finding guide. And so I started giving her the names, and I was like, well, I'm really interested in Elizabeth Holloway Marston, Wonder Woman, Olive Byrne, Ethel Byrne. And she'd be like listing off, she'd be like, well, try box 204, folder 7. And we're going through these and through these and through these. And then suddenly she just looks at me, and she says really loudly for our librarian, "Oh my God! Wonder Woman is Margaret Sanger!" And I looked at her and I said, "Shh." Like, it's this thing that, like, only someone who was an archivist who'd been through all these papers and then could sort of put the pieces together in her head, or who was me, who was following a different, could sort of see. But the thing is, the people who've been writing the history of feminism, I'm sorry, we're not surprised you don't, are not big comic book fans. Like, and the people that write the history of comics, I'm sorry, we're not surprised you know, are not big feminism fans. So they really, you could have missed it all this time. Like, you look at it now, and I'm like, obviously, like, that's Hugo Munsterberg, and that's Lou Rogers. It kind of all makes sense. But so once I saw that in the archives, I really felt like that needed to be said because of that missing piece, that missing link story I gave. But I wouldn't have been able to do it, so I wrote to Byrne Holloway Marston, who is Olive Byrne and William Marston's and Elizabeth Holloway's son, their second son, and he's the sort of literary executor. He's a retired obstetrician. And I wrote to him and I said, does the family have papers? I'd really like to do a book about this history of Wonder Woman. My interest is in its relationship to Planned Parenthood. And he had read the New Yorker piece, and it talks about Ethel Byrne, who's his grandmother, who no one ever talks about. No one ever talks about Ethel Byrne. And he had been, I think, really touched by that someone had bothered to do the research to know that she was really, at the beginning, more important than Sanger even. So, they had, for all kinds of reasons that I completely respect and would certainly have shared in their position, had never really shown anybody the family stuff. It had been really painful for everybody for a long time. And he thought about it, and he decided to let me look at. And oh my God, diaries, photographs, letters, scripts. And it turned out there was a great deal in university archives because all these people were highly educated. So I wouldn't have been able to do the project without the family's incredible generosity of letting me look at the material, much of which is now at the Schlesinger Library for the History of American Women here at Radcliffe, because some parts of the family have donated their collections, which is fantastic, because I couldn't do it justice. Olive Byrne, for instance, wrote a memoir that was never published. It's really unbelievably interesting. So there's still great material to be mined. But it was just, a story that hadn't been told for all kinds of reasons. And I think, to the extent that I think can be very badly told in the world today, right? Like, I think it's a risk showing someone your family's unconventional sexual history, because people are gross, and people will want to write gross things about it and say gross things about it and make disturbing films about, like, I think that's a real, it's a real source of sadness to me. But I hope that the book that I wrote, the way I thought about the family story, I talked to all of the children who survive and the widow of the one son who does not survive. The family life actually just kind of sounds like a 1930s screwball comedy, honestly. It didn't sound like a horror show. It sounded like, yeah, with 30s screwball comedy. Maybe you have time for one more question? Yeah. There is a movie coming out in October that is by people who did not buy the rights to my book, and I had no involvement in the book. Yeah.
What did Marston feel about all of this, like, before he died, like, as he was near his end? Do you know?
Feel about what?
Just the, like, I guess first and foremost, the influence that he had on, the women's movement, and maybe if he had any feelings about, like, the family situation.
I think he's a really difficult character to make sense of, because people will often point this out. So when they read my book, I'll get letters from people like, well, it seems like his wife, who was trained as an attorney, had a graduate degree in psychology as well, supported the family financially. She worked every day from 7. She took the train to New York at 7, and she came home at 7. And Olive Byrne raised the children. And Marston sort of kind of screwed around. Like, he sometimes made money, and he sometimes didn't make money. He drank a lot. He was kind of difficult to live with. Like, why is he some hero of feminism? Like, his domestic arrangements seem kind of grim. I don't think they were as grim as that makes it sound, but I think people tend to be really sort of suspicious, like, how could he be a feminist? Like, he doesn't meet my test. I think that he quite genuinely believed that women were more powerful than men because of their maternal drive and their capacity to care for others and look out for others, and that they were morally superior to men. And if women were the elected leaders of our society, we would have a more peaceable world. This was also the view of 19th century feminists. It was an elaborate kind of maternalist ideology that drove suffragism in the 19th century. And he inherited probably from his mother and his many maiden aunts who raised him. He was the only son of, like, I think there were like 6 sisters. He was just raised by this kind of tribe of women. And I think they were all school teachers. They all had professions, and including his mother. And I think he felt they were strong and they should be in charge. I think his father was in and out of, like, bankruptcy court and was kind of a failure. One of the things that I hadn't seen before I wrote the book were letters between Marston and his mother, who lived for quite a long time, lived through when Wonder Woman started. But after the book came out, a part of the family I had not met said, we have all these things, including, like, batches of letters. And he and his mother wrote to each other constantly. And it's hilarious because she's this sort of Victorian feminist. But when he starts writing Wonder, he really wants her approval. He really wants her to like Wonder Woman, and she doesn't like her costume. Anyway, it's been really fun speaking with you all. Thanks a lot.